Hi there. I'll be your professor in this course. Now, don't worry, I'm not actually going to teach the class from inside a video game, but I am going to show you how some of the techniques that designers use in games like this one can be applied to problems in business, education, health, and other fields. That's a technique that we call gamification. Hang on a second, I'll get out of here. Much better. Hi there, I'm Kevin Werbach, a professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm thrilled that so many of you have signed up for this online course about the emerging field of gamification. In the next 6 weeks, I'm going to teach you about what gamification means and how you can apply it to solve real-world problems. Some of you may not be familiar with the concept of gamification, so let me give a brief introduction here. I'll give you a much more concrete and detailed definition later on. Gamification is about learning from games. So, what can we learn from Angry Birds? Well, we can learn that there's something really popular there. Angry Birds in its various incarnations has been downloaded over 1 billion times. Can 1 billion people be wrong? But there's more to it than that. Gamification is about learning from games, not just in the sense of learning about the games themselves, but understanding what makes the game successful, understanding what makes the games engaging, understanding what games can do, why games have power, and then taking some of those techniques and thoughtfully applying them to other situations which are not themselves games. So, for example, let me show you a service called Samsung Nation. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail later on. Samsung Nation is something that Samsung has on its corporate website. And it's a system using what we call game elements or game mechanics to solve Samsung's business problem, which is they want more people to come to their site. And they want people to do things on their site to interact with their products, to write product reviews, to watch videos, to find out more, to register products that they've already bought. So what Samsung has done here is to build a site using simple elements that they've developed from games. Things like leaderboards, things like badges to reward achievements, things like point systems. And they've taken these and applied them to a situation that isn't a game. The situation is Samsung wants you to spend time and do stuff on their website so that you will eventually buy more products. That's an example of gamification. It's not by any means the only kind of example of gamification. As we'll see, gamification is by no means limited to these kinds of contexts that you see here, but it's a good example as a starting point of what we're talking about. So in the next series of lectures, I'll start to unpack what exactly gamification means, which will then allow us to start to understand how to do it effectively and what are some of the challenges in applying these techniques. And if you're curious about what the things are on the bookcases behind me, well, you'll just have to watch the rest of the videos to find out. So, what's this course about? It's important, I think, to start with a set of learning goals, especially because gamification is a novel concept. It's not something like introductory physics, where it's obvious what a course is going to teach you about. So there are 4 things that I hope that you will get out of this course if you stick with it all the way through, watch the videos, do the homework, and so forth. The first is to understand what gamification is. The second is to understand how it might be valuable. The third is to learn how to do it effectively. And the fourth is to understand some specific concrete applications of gamification. So let me say a little bit about each of those. What is gamification is not obvious. Gamification is a new concept, and in many ways it's misunderstood. So we'll talk a lot about understanding just what gamification is and what it isn't, as well as some of the history and some of the context for this emerging business practice. Then we'll talk about how gamification can be used and why it might be effective. And notice I say here might be. Gamification is a powerful tool. And I'll give you lots of examples of companies and other organizations that are successfully applying game mechanics and applying other lessons from games to address their problems. But it's important to have some measure of skepticism, to realize that gamification isn't right for every problem. It's not by any means a panacea. And furthermore, doing gamification requires you to understand how to do it well. And that's why we have this third learning goal, to talk about how to do gamification effectively. You can understand how gamification might be relevant to a problem, but you need to understand the different techniques, the different components that you can use, and the pros and cons of different forms of gamification in order to know how to do the right sort of thing when faced with a particular situation. And finally, some applications. There will be examples running throughout the course, some of them in for-profit business contexts, some of them in nonprofit social impact kinds of contexts. But we'll look towards the end of the course at some specific domains like inside the enterprise and for social good, where there are particular issues that come up with applying gamification. It's important to note this is not a technical class. There are no technical prerequisites. There's not going to be any coding involved. It's also not a full-blown game design course. So there's no requirement that you be familiar with any of the technical or aesthetic aspects, artistic aspects of being a game designer. We're going to talk about some of those concepts in the course because in order to do gamification effectively, even just as a business person, you need to understand something about game design. But there are no detailed prerequisites involved. Anyone who has a basic kind of understanding about online services and about digital technology will be fine understanding this course. I mention all of the stuff behind me on the bookcases. Keep an eye on it. You might notice some changes, some things that look different from video to video. And if you really notice what's going on, you might notice something else from time to time appearing back there, and who knows, maybe a message. Now, this course is novel in a few different ways, which I wanted to highlight here at the outset. The first, obviously, is this new method of open online delivery. That's something that has been used in certain experiments for the past few years, but has really expanded greatly only recently. So this is a new way for me in teaching, and probably for you, a fairly new way in learning this kind of material. But this course in particular has some other aspects that distinguish it even from other courses that use this mechanism. The first is that gamification is a brand new concept. As I'll talk about, it has roots that go back many years. And it's going to draw on some very old concepts in psychology and management and so forth. But gamification as a phrase to describe what I'm going to talk about is really only a couple of years old. And as I said, just understanding what gamification is not universal today. So we're going to have to start by learning what the concept is to begin with. The third thing that's new is that this is a new course. I've taught on this subject in person at the Wharton School at Penn. In fact, I think that I offered the first class on gamification for business that had ever been offered anywhere at any university. But for this massive open online version on Coursera, I rebuilt the course entirely from scratch to take advantage of some of the unique aspects of this new kind of online environment. And finally, this course is about practical knowledge, which may be somewhat different from some of the other courses that you take on an open online platform that focus on understanding concepts. This is not necessarily about theory. There's a lot of theory that we'll touch on that goes into concepts we discussed in the class, but this is a course ultimately that is designed to give you some practical knowledge. That's designed to help you understand how gamification is used today in the real world and how you potentially can be someone who uses it yourself. Now, as we go along, I'll point you to various links and other information if you want to dig deeper into gamification concepts. But one resource in particular that many students find helpful is my book, For the Win, How Game Thinking Can Revolutionize Your Business, which I co-wrote with a colleague, Dan Hunter. It's not a required text. You don't have to purchase it in order to take the course, but I hope that you will take a look and consider it. Students often find that the book is helpful because it's laid out in the same basic structure as the course and expands upon it with additional examples and frameworks and that you can then take with you after you finish up the MOOC. It's available in ebook form on all the major ebook platforms and also in paperback. It's also now available, in addition to English, in Spanish and Japanese translation, with a number of other translations in the works. If you go to the link at the bottom of the page, the Wharton Digital Press link, it will give you a list of retailers to purchase it in ebook or hard copy format in various countries around the world. So I hope that you will at least take a look at the book and consider it as a useful resource to deepen your understanding of gamification. What is gamification? I thought you'd never ask. This is all very new, so there's not one universally accepted definition, but let me offer you the following, which has the major components that we see generally when people talk about the concept. Gamification is the use of game elements and game design techniques in non-game contexts. There are three parts to that definition. The first is game elements. I'll talk about this in much more detail, what exactly that means, in a later session. The second is game design techniques, and the third is non-game context. So let me give you an example or two, and then I'll explain about each of these in a little bit more detail. So the first example is Nike Plus. Nike, of course, makes shoes. They make running shoes, and therefore Nike wants people to run more. And so what they did with Nike Plus was developed a device. It uses a piece of equipment called an accelerometer that fits into the sole of your shoe. And it tracks every single step you take when you're running. And so therefore the device knows how far and how fast you're running, and it communicates wirelessly with a smartphone or your PC, which can aggregate together all of that data. And then what Nike did was build a set of applications around it that made the experience of running more game-like. So the Nike Plus application has some functions like, for example, telling how far you've run, the fastest run you've ever had, the longest run you've ever had, various kinds of tracking data. You can also compare yourself to previous times and so forth to track what you're doing. But then interestingly, you can also establish goals and challenges. And if you are successful in achieving those goals, you get a trophy or a medal. Now that sure seems a lot like a game. And Nike has built all sorts of other features into this system, including the ability to compete against friends or the ability to get encouragement from friends. And overall what this does is takes the experience of running and makes it feel somehow more like the experience of engaging in some kind of game. Now you're still going out and running. This is not saying go sit down in front of your computer and play a running game and see how fast the avatar, the character in the computer can run. No, you're actually going out and running. But the game structures around it help to encourage you and to make that whole experience of running feel somehow richer and more rewarding. Second example, also for the purpose of getting people to run, but it looks very different. So this is something called Zombies Run, and the theme here is that you're being chased by an army of bloodthirsty zombies. Pretty common kind of motif. Hopefully not something that any of you have experienced, but a common setup for games. Only here, the goal is not to get you to sit indoors on your smartphone and play the game. The goal is to get you to take that phone with you and go out and run. And as you're running, the Zombies Run game is telling you that actually the reason you're running is that you're running away from this army of zombies that wants to kill you and eat your brains. And as you go, you'll hear from the game if the zombies are getting closer, and you can see on a map where they are. You can get to power packs that will help you get special powers or go faster. Your friends can get in the mix as well. The game that you are playing, it's a very lightweight game, but it's taking the experience of running and now subtly making it feel like more fun. Suddenly adding another dimension to that experience of running. different kind of added dimension to what we saw in Nike Plus. This is a much more immersive kind of game-like experience as opposed to the challenges and rewards and so forth that Nike Plus had, but both are examples of using game elements and game design techniques to serve a purpose which itself is outside of the game. So those are good examples of what we're talking about here. So now let's go back to the definition and unpack in some more detail what these three aspects are: game elements, game design techniques, non-game context. First of all, game elements. You can think of game elements as the toolbox, if you will, the pieces that you have to work with if you are trying to build some kind of service that uses the bits and pieces of games. Not the games themselves, but the regular design patterns that make up the games. So let me give you an example. This is Empires and Allies. It's a casual social game on Facebook made by Zynga. And clearly this is a game. We can see the kind of graphical interface that we typically see in a game and the various kinds of pieces that give a game-like experience. You don't need to know how to play the game. You just can look at it and see that's a game. But if we look below the surface, we can start to break down what are some of the elements of that game. So, for example, the game has points. A way of keeping score as you are accumulating something in the game. That's a very common thing that's in games. We sort of take it for granted that lots of games, especially online or computer games, have points. But that's the whole point, if you will. It's a regular pattern that occurs in many of these games. Similarly, you can level up. You can collect resources here. I believe these are barrels of oil that you've accumulated that you use to build other more complex things in the game. The game can send you on quests, define missions where the game says, go defeat this enemy and you'll get certain kinds of rewards. Avatars showing your character, the social graph showing you your friends who you can play with or challenge and so forth. These are all bits and pieces that go to make up this experience that is Empires and Allies. They're not the whole experience. There's a lot more to the game than this, but they are parts of the game that we can pull out and then think about reusing. And the point here with gamification is that we can do this with games. We can look at what are the elements at different levels of the game, but we can also do the same thing for services that are not games. So here's an example. This is called Kias. It's a service that helps people in companies engage in activities to make them healthier, whether that's exercise or eating well and so forth. The company was started by a guy named Adam Bosworth, who was at Microsoft and BEA Systems and later ran Google Health. Kias, the way it works is that you form groups within your company and you get a series of challenges and you report on your activities, things like exercising and so forth. And what we see here is exactly the same kinds of elements that we saw in Empires and Allies. So we see again the points and we see again the levels. And if you look at this interface for points and levels in Kias, it looks very similar to the one that we saw in Empires and Allies. I mean, graphically, it's almost the identical thing on the screen. And that's not by accident. Here, Kias is using a familiar structure that some of their players or participants may have seen, and not only adopting the conceptual elements, but adopting some of the aesthetics of them as well. Similarly, here are the quests that you go on. Here's the social graph, seeing what your friends do. Here are the avatars, the visual graphical representation of each participant. Here we also see rewards. If you do certain things in the game, you get more points or you get other benefits. And down here, you can't really see it on the screen, but you see the label for it, badges. These devices that demarcate or represent a certain achievement in the game. So there aren't exactly the same game elements in the Kias service as in Empires and Allies, but you can see there's a great deal of overlap. And the notion of elements, the notion that there are these regular design patterns, is something that's common across games as well as gamified services. So that's what I mean when we're talking about game elements. The second thing here to talk about in gamification is game design techniques. And the reason we need to talk about that is that games are not just the elements. As I already said, there's partly the visual experience of the game. But more than that, games are not just a jumble of elements that have been stuck together in some haphazard way. Games are things that are designed systematically, thoughtfully, artistically, for the purpose of being fun. And so the things that game designers do is not just a matter of pure engineering. There's a lot of engineering involved. There's a lot of algorithms, a lot of technology involved. But there's also an artistic, experiential side of game design that involves thinking about problems in a certain way. And that involves taking an approach that uses concepts that are common to all forms of design, as well as some concepts that are novel and specific to designing these things called games. And here especially I'm talking about video games, although some of them relate to all games. That kind of practice is something that, like game elements, can be applied outside of games. And some examples of gamification are more focused on the elements, and some of them are more focused on the game design modality, and some have elements of both. That's why both are part of the definition. The other thing to understand about game design techniques is that it involves a way of thinking. It's not just a set of practices, but it's a way to approach the challenges that you have. And so later on in the course, I'll talk in much more detail about just what that means to think like a game designer. The third piece here is non-game context. And here we mean anything other than the game for its own sake. So when you're playing a game, you're playing to have fun in the game. But if you are playing, say, for reasons that relate to your business, you're playing because you're serving some objective of your company, or you're playing because you're trying to learn something that's relevant to your work, or you're playing to get a job, then that's a non-game context. What you're doing may still be game-like, but the purpose, the rationale for the experience is something outside of the game. It's some purpose that has a validity and an intention independently of the experience of the game. And that doesn't just have to be business, although most of the examples we use will start with that context. It could be something like running. Now, running is important to Nike for the purpose of selling shoes, but running is important to people who are doing it for the purpose of being healthy and for the purpose of having all of the benefits that people feel like they get from running. So non-game context is anything where your objective is outside of the game. So circumstances where something involves some combination of game elements and game design that is for a purpose other than playing the game, that's gamification. So why should we study gamification? Maybe I should ask you that after all of you signed up for this course, but it's worth pausing for a minute and asking the question of why this is worth the kind of extended analysis that we're going to do in this class. Because it's just games, right? Well, there are 4 reasons that I think the systematic study of gamification is fruitful. And we're going to see more and more gamification being a regular subject that's taught about both in training context and in university educational context. The first of these is that gamification is a significant emerging business practice. We're seeing lots and lots of examples come up from many different kinds of companies, as well as in non-business contexts, where gamification is being applied. So here's just a couple examples from the recent press. An article from Fortune magazine from October 2011 talking about gamification as the hot new business concept. And while I certainly wouldn't say just follow something because it's a hyped trend, the important thing is many of the world's most admired companies are starting to get on board with this. It's not just something that's happening among kooky startups. It's something that's being adopted by very large established companies. This second article here from the Wall Street Journal talking about how a growing number of firms are incorporating elements of video games into the workplace. So video games, as I'll talk about in more detail, have become a huge and influential industry. But what we're starting to see is more and more examples of video games being the foundation not just for selling games, but for the foundation of doing things at and around the workplace. So gamification is something that's happening, and as I said, it's happening very widely. So here is a list of a few of the companies that are applying gamification in substantial ways. And as you'll see, they range from small, very technology-focused startups to big, very consumer products-focused, established bricks-and-mortar companies. And some of these are companies that went out consciously and tried to implement gamification around one of their business practices. And some of them are companies that just developed something that in hindsight was game-like, and they just thought that it was a good way to attack a particular problem they had. But in both cases, when we look at what's happening out there, there's a growing recognition that this set of techniques has value, and it has value in a very broad set of circumstances. The second reason to think that gamification is worth greater scrutiny is that games are powerful things. We probably all had the experience of saying, wow, I was really addicted to that game. Or time just seemed to fly by. And maybe it's a video game. Maybe you had that experience with a board or a card game. Maybe you had that experience playing sports. But games have a real pull on us. There's something that is extremely powerful when we think about it, given that we think of them as experiences that are done just for enjoyment. So what is it that makes games engaging? What is it that allows games to support sophisticated kinds of thinking and learning, as we'll see? What is it about games that makes them so engaging? That's an important question to ask. And it's a question that gets asked about among the community of people who study games in their own right. But it's a question that becomes relevant when the games are being used, or at least the game elements and design principles are being used in these non-game contexts. It's worth starting to dig down and say, just what is it about games that's so significant? The third reason to study gamification is because it teaches us things about other areas of knowledge as well. So as we'll see, when we get into gamification, we're going to very quickly get into psychology. Games have been around throughout all of human history because they link to some very basic aspects of the way our minds work. And so to understand how to design things that are effectively gamified, we need to understand about, for example, motivation. What is it that makes someone want to do something? What are different kinds of motivation? And what are different techniques that can be used to help people achieve their goals? So we'll learn about psychology. We'll also learn about design. As I've already talked about, gamification is a design practice. So understanding how to do it necessarily gets us into thinking about the very sophisticated, complex world of design. Strategy. I teach at a business school, and understanding gamification in the organization ties into lots of things that people here talk about in understanding how to do business, understanding what it means to lead in the workplace, understanding what it means to design an effective marketing campaign. These are all areas of knowledge that we're going to bring to bear in understanding what makes gamification work. And finally, technology. Games, as I said, have been around forever, and many games don't involve any sophisticated technology. But the ability of today's networked information technology to create rich, immersive, personalized experiences and to track interactions in real time and aggregate and analyze them and make use of them is incredibly powerful when applied to gamification. So most of the examples that we're going to see are going to be examples in the world of online activities, whether online services or technology startups. The gamification is applied in a digital internet-based context. And so understanding what it is about that environment that makes gamification successful will provide a window into understanding aspects of technology as well. And the final reason that we should study gamification is that it's not that easy. It's not that obvious. Once you understand what gamification is, you may think, great, so I see that Nike Plus uses challenges and awards and trophies to get people to do stuff. Well, I'll just put some challenges and trophies in my business practice and people will flock to it. Turns out it's not that easy. Turns out that doing gamification well, doing gamification ethically, doing gamification in a way that fits in with your ultimate long-term business objectives is not trivial. It requires thought, it requires recourse to those various different areas of knowledge that I talked about. And so this is something that we can't just give you a cookbook. I can't just say, here's the list of game elements, have at them. You need to understand them within a broader context, and that's exactly what this course is intended to provide. So where does gamification come from? As I've said, it's pretty new as a business concept. But as it turns out, its roots go way back. 100 years ago, the Cracker Jack Company started putting a toy surprise in every box. And since then, countless companies have used games and toys and other kinds of fun as a way of selling products. There are many other related examples like the S&H green stamps, frequent flyer programs, and so forth that have some of these components in them. But they aren't really gamification in the sense we talk about today in terms of systematically thinking about how to make things more game-like and thus drive business results. The first example that we can find of the term gamification was from 1980. It involves Richard Bartle, who's a noted game designer and researcher at the University of Essex in England, and he was brought into a project called Mud1. Mud1 was the first multi-user domain or multi-user dungeon, essentially the first massively multiplayer online game. Didn't look like much. As you see here, it was a text-based system on a university computer network. But Mud1 was the first time people could experience a shared virtual world in this way, and thus was a precursor for things like Second Life and World of Warcraft today. Bartle's role in this project was to take what was basically a collaboration platform and gamify it, make it feel more game-like. So he actually jokes today that gamification then meant taking something that wasn't a game and making it a game. Whereas now it involves breaking games down into these constituent elements, so taking an actual game and turning it into something that's really not a game. The work that Bartle did was called gamification, but it really wasn't the same kind of thing that we see today. But there were other developments at the time that helped to lay the groundwork for today's gamification. One of them was research by education scholars looking at video games and learning. So Tom Malone, who is now at the Sloan School of Business at MIT, started around this time doing work on early video games. Remember, this was 1980, very early, simplistic games on early PCs, but he was able to show kids could learn from playing these video games. Since then, a number of researchers have done similar and more sophisticated work. One of them is James Paul Gee, who's at Arizona State University. He's written a number of books about how video games, even off-the-shelf, commercial, entertainment-oriented games like the Tomb Raider series, encode powerful knowledge creation and learning mechanisms that relate to all of the deep research that we have on how people learn. A second stream of work that contributed to today's gamification is the Serious Games movement. The Serious Games Initiative was founded in 2002 by Ben Sawyer and David Rajewski, and it brought together the communities in the private sector, academia, and the military that were using games, full-fledged games, for training and simulation, various kinds of non-game purposes. So, for example, the military was very interested in being able to simulate the battlefield and also in being able to use games as training mechanisms for the thousands upon thousands of soldiers and others that it has to train every year. and many companies had similar interests. Now, serious games are different in a sense from what we're talking about in this course because they're full-blown games. You have to actually build the simulation for a particular purpose. That's very powerful, and there have been tremendous accomplishments using serious games, and the work on serious games informs much of what we're doing on gamification today, but it's distinct for that reason. The Games for Change movement is a related initiative or set of initiatives that focuses on using games for social impact. For example, letting you play a side in the Arab-Israeli conflict in a game called Peacemaker to understand some of the complexities of that incredibly knotty issue. Games are great for teaching systems thinking, for showing you that your individual actions fit into a much more complex, larger whole, which is valuable for pure education and is also valuable in trying to promote understanding of major social issues. Now, the first time that gamification was used in something like the current sense was 2003. When Nick Pelling, a British developer and designer, set up a consulting firm called Conundra, which was there to promote gamification of consumer products. He wanted to take hardware products and make them more game-like. Didn't have a lot of success. The consultancy didn't last all that long, but it was an indication of this notion that game mechanics and game concepts could be applied in this way to consumer products and other kinds of situations. In 2005, a company called Bunchball was founded. In 2007, it launched its product, which was really the first modern gamification platform. They didn't call it that at the time because, again, the word was not in common usage, but it was the first platform that incorporated mechanics like points and leaderboards and so forth to serve engagement purposes in companies. Since then, Bunchball has been joined by a number of competitors like Badgeville and Big Door and Gigya. There are a variety of companies now that offer these gamification platforms to companies. And then there also are specialized service providers, companies like Kios, which I mentioned, and Practically Green and Ripple, Salesforce, which offer gamification services to companies in specific areas, as well as many companies now that are building gamification services and systems on their own. In 2010, gamification really took off. This was partly because the community reached critical mass and they agreed to use gamification as the common term, but also partly because of the set of presentations that really crystallized the idea of gamification for people. Probably the most prominent was a presentation by Jesse Schell, a well-known game developer who has his own firm called Schell Games and also teaches at Carnegie Mellon University. Jesse Schell spoke at the DICE conference, a big games industry confab in 2010, and his presentation immediately went viral. Let's look at a clip of it and see why.
And what will that world be like? Well, I think it'll be like this. You'll get up in the morning to brush your teeth, and the toothbrush can sense that you're brushing your teeth, and so, hey, good job for you. 10 points for brushing your teeth. And it can measure how long, and you're supposed to brush them for 3 minutes, and you did. Good job, you brushed your teeth for 3 minutes. And so you get a bonus for that. And hey, you brushed your teeth every day this week, another bonus. And who cares? The toothpaste company, the toothbrush company, the more you brush, the more toothpaste you use, they have a vested financial interest. You go to breakfast, there's the cornflakes. On the back, there's a little web game that you can play. While you eat, instead of reading the back, you play a game while you eat your cornflakes. And you get that, and you get 10 points just for eating the cornflakes. And then it turns out you can see your list of friends who also have cornflakes and the scores that they got because your Wi-Fi and Facebook connected and everything. And so, you get 5 bonus points because you just beat out one of your friends at the cornflakes game. So then you go and you get on the bus. The bus? Why am I taking the bus? You're taking the bus because the government has started giving out all kinds of bonus points to people who use public transportation. And you can use these points for tax incentives. And while you're sitting on the bus riding to work and you're playing your little Tetris and getting a few points here and there, you suddenly remember, I had this dream last night. I had a dream that my mother was dancing with this giant Pepsi can. And then you realize, oh yeah, the REMtertainment system, right, which is the thing you put in your ear and it can sense when you enter REM sleep. And then it starts putting little advertisements out there to try and influence your dreams. And then you can fill out a little form. It's a test to see if those things came through into your dreams. And if they did, then big points for you.
Okay, it's a great presentation. I encourage you to watch the rest of it if you can. The link to the YouTube video is there. Now, of course, Jesse was being a little bit sarcastic there, but also pushing people to think about just where this could go. And again, it really lit a fire in terms of getting people to imagine the potential of gamification. Something else that had that effect the same year was Jane McGonigal's book, Reality is Broken, and a TED talk that she gave at that point. Jane is a game designer known for her work on what are called alternate reality games, games that are embedded into the real world. And she talked about how games could actually solve major human problems, help us address things like climate change or inequality in the developing world, and otherwise make people more healthy, more complete, more engaged, and more successful. Jane herself doesn't like the term gamification. She doesn't use it in the book, and she's concerned that gamification trivializes the possibilities of using full-fledged, deep, immersive games to address these issues. But many of her ideas about how games work, how games motivate, are things that we're also going to talk about here in this course under the banner of gamification. So today, gamification is starting to mature. It's still new. We're still developing the ideas, but there are conferences and many companies in different areas of the gamification space. There are market research reports giving big figures about the gamification industry. I would take all their specific numbers with a grain of salt, but clearly something is going on here. And clearly the industry is reaching a point where it's real and significant. So we've come a long way, but we also have a long way to go. Congratulations! You've made it to the last segment of the first unit of the class. You've earned a badge. Okay, I'm being a bit sarcastic there. That's a pretty poor use of gamification without any real context or sense of meaning or integration in a thoughtful way with the underlying process. But hey, you deserve some pat on the back for getting this far. Oh, one more thing. You may recall early on I alluded to the fact that you should keep an eye on what's behind me on the bookcases. There's one more little game that will be embedded in the videos, starting with the next unit. Periodically, you'll see something else that shows up, and there's a message that's encoded in that information. Okay. So in this last segment of the first unit, I'm going to give you some examples of gamification in practice and a framework for different places where gamification can be used. There are three main categories, three main areas, broadly speaking, where gamification adds value. And these are external, internal, and behavior change contexts. So the first one is external. And here I mean external to the firm or the organization that you're in. So typically these are applications of gamification for customers or for potential customers, things like marketing and sales contexts. The second is internal gamification, which, as you might guess, is about applications of gamification to people who are in your company already, employees typically. I also put here crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing we'll talk more about later, but it's a process of reaching out to lots and lots of people and either breaking up a task into very small pieces. For example, trying to find a new star on very detailed, complex NASA star charts by giving each person a little teeny piece of it to look over. Or crowdsourcing involves situations where there's a challenge that's sent out to many people and anyone who wants to can respond to the challenge. For example, trying to win a prize that's put out as a general challenge to whoever wants to respond. Crowdsourcing is not internal in the sense that it's people who work for one company, but it's internal in the sense of within a community. The organization that launches the challenge needs to get lots of people to actively participate. And crowdsourcing either may involve no monetary reward at all, or it may involve people who aren't part of your company to begin with, and therefore even if there is a reward, finding them and getting them to submit and participate requires some effort. Gamification can provide that motivation. As in the other cases, gamification can encourage people to participate when they otherwise might not. The third category for gamification is behavior change. And here I'm talking about situations where someone typically wants to do something, or at least appreciates the value of doing something, but can't get over the hump. You know you should go to the gym more, but it's hard. Motivation through gamification can potentially change that behavior, make that practice into more of a habit. So behavior change gamification is often, although as we'll see, not entirely social impact kinds of contexts, things where there's some either personal or community benefit in the activity, but the problem is getting people to engage in it even though they know it's something they want to do. Three broad categories of gamification. Let's look at an example in each category. The first one is an external case, and this is something called Club Psych. First question is whether you can find the game elements in Club Psych. Club Psych was set up by USA Network, a US cable channel, for one of their popular shows called Psych. They have a regular website for the show, but a few years ago they set up a new gamified website to get people more engaged with the show. So this website uses many of the game mechanics that we've already seen when we introduced the concept. See how many you can find in the screenshot here. As you can see, Club Psych uses many of the game elements that we saw earlier when I showed you Empires and Allies and Chios. So you can do various things that give you points, and ultimately the points earn you rewards. Very common process, especially in these external marketing focused gamification examples. And you can even earn badges. And the badges here, this one looks something like a pineapple. If you watch the show Psych, that's a recurring motif in the show. One of the things that they've done with Club Psych is made sure to integrate what they do with game mechanics with other aspects of the show. It's not just a generic gamification implementation. It's tied into motifs so that people feel like it's an extension of the show experience. Here, down here, we see the leaderboard. Here we see the player's avatar. And here we see challenges or quests encouraging you to do things. All the same kinds of mechanics that we saw already. So USA Network implemented this gamified website for Psych. What were the results? They were pretty successful. So overall visits to the USA Network website went up 30%. Online merchandise sales, a real direct bottom line impact in terms of revenues, went up 50%. Page views on the Club Psych site, or the Psych website overall, went up 130%. They more than doubled the number of views of the site around the show, and they got people to share content on Facebook as part of the challenges in this gamified service. 300,000 times people shared content, which meant 40 million users were able to see that content. The audience for Psych is only about 4.5 million, so this was a big marketing bump for them by virtue of these relatively simple, relatively generic, although well-implemented game mechanics. A second example is an internal example, and this comes from Microsoft. Microsoft has a big challenge. They put out software like Windows and Office to millions of people in hundreds of different countries and dozens of different languages. And it's a real challenge to make that software work well. They have a large group of people involved in testing and quality assurance. And the challenge that that test group has is there's so many people who use Microsoft software in so many places. Even a company as big and well endowed as Microsoft can't necessarily get out there and get people to look at everything thoroughly. Think about it. Windows is in dozens of different languages, and there aren't necessarily localization testing firms in all of those countries that Microsoft could hire, even if they wanted to pore over the text and the dialog boxes and the interface elements of an application like Windows to ensure that there weren't some errors. So what Microsoft's test group did on that case, dealing with localization of Windows, was ingenious. They gamified it. The test group, led by a guy named Ross Smith at Microsoft, developed a game. This is called the Language Quality Game, which you see here, that was used for Microsoft internally to test localization of Windows 7. So here's an example screen of language quality game. And you see in the middle here or on the side a dialog box in some language. Probably some people viewing this know what language it is. I'm not familiar with the alphabet, but it's certainly not English. They would put this out to Microsoft employees who worked in that country. Not an outside firm they paid, volunteer Microsoft employees. They said, look, this is a chance to do your part for your company. And guess what? It's also a chance to compete against other Microsoft offices. Because as you see, there's a leaderboard here about how many bugs people found. You click OK if the dialog box looks OK, but if you see something that looks wrong, a term that seems out of place, you click that there's something wrong, and that gets recorded. And what happened was Microsoft offices started to compete. They said, gee, we're going to make our language localization of Windows the best one in the company. And that game-like aspect of this process, even though what it involved was very mind-numbing, sitting and reading dialog boxes, the fact that it was put into a game-like framework, a competitive framework, led to very significant results. Turns out that over 4,000 Microsoft employees were willing to sit for free and look at these dialog boxes. They looked at over 500,000 dialog boxes, found close to 7,000 bugs. 7,000 times they found something out of place, and several hundred of those turned out to be actual bugs in localization that Microsoft was able to fix. So the gamification was the mechanism that encouraged people to take this action. Now, this again was internal, so it wasn't for money, it wasn't necessarily for individual recognition, it was part of their corporate citizenship around something outside of their normal job responsibilities. But again, the game structure made it fun, made it enjoyable, and helped to get people to participate. The third example is a behavior change example, and maybe not one of the ones you might expect. This example has to do with speeding. So how do the police get people not to speed? Well, the traditional way they do it is by putting a guy like this with a radar gun and sitting there and watching, and if you're caught speeding, you get a ticket and you have to pay a fine. Well, that works okay, but it's incredibly imperfect. People only will slow down if they think there's going to be a cop there, and there's no way there's going to be a cop on every corner at every time. So what some police departments have done is put in monitors, put in devices that show you how fast you're going as you're going by. And that has actually had some effect, even when they aren't tied to the police department. They're just telling you your speed. That provides some feedback. Seeing real-time feedback causes a behavior loop. It causes people to react. So even though you know how fast you're going, or you could know how fast you're going just by looking at the speedometer, seeing a sign up in front of you telling you your speed in real time tends to have an effect and actually causes people often to slow down. Now, potentially, though, we could go further than this. Volkswagen had a contest called the Fun Theory. It was a marketing program where they encouraged people to submit great ideas for using games and fun to solve real-world problems. The winner was something called the Speed Camera Lottery. It was submitted by a guy who works for MTV in the United States, and his idea was this. Instead of just finding people who go too fast, what if we do the following? Set up one of those monitoring devices that tracks how people drive and shows them how fast they're going, and have a camera on it as well that takes a picture of people and their license plate. So it knows who people are going by and how fast they're going. But instead of having that be a way to catch people who are speeding, do something different with it. Have the normal cops there tracking people with radar guns and finding people when they're speeding. But also, anytime someone goes by the sign that tracks their speed and they're not speeding, enter them into a lottery. Give them effectively one ticket in a lottery. Where does the money come from? Well, the money comes from the fines from the people who are caught speeding. Some of that money that would otherwise go to the government goes into a pool, and at some point there's a lottery, and a winner gets picked out of the people who aren't speeding. So Volkswagen actually got the city of Stockholm in Sweden to try this, and the results were actually pretty dramatic. People slowed down. People slowed down over 20% over a 3-day period when they trialed this system, even though all that was changed was that they could win some money by not speeding. The addition of the lottery, the addition of the game or competition element to this activity changed people's behavior. So that's an example of behavior change. As I said, many of the other ones we see will be behaviors that have some social benefit. I guess this one does in terms of people not speeding, but it's a different approach taken by a government agency that, as we see, drives actual results. So what do we learn from these examples? Well, the first one is motivation. Gamification can motivate. It can get people to do things that either they really want to do or maybe they're not so sure they want to do, but it's a good idea for them to do it. The second thing is that there are many different areas where motivation is important and where gamification can help. I've given you 3 different major categories: external, internal, and behavior change. And the third one is gamification is not unitary. These examples weren't all the same. They didn't all use the same elements. Not all of them had points or levels or anything like that. There's a broad range of techniques that can be used in gamification, all tied together by general principles of drawing on game elements and game design techniques to solve non-game problems. I'm going to say a great deal about what gamification is, but first I want to say a little about what gamification is not. There's a tremendous amount of confusion about just what gamification means, how it relates to different other game-related concepts, and so it's important to clear that up and put gamification in context before we move forward. First point, gamification is not turning everything into a game. I hear this a lot. Oh, so you're saying we're all going to be playing World of Warcraft at work, or we'll all be in some virtual environment like Second Life on the job. No, in fact, gamification in many ways is the opposite. Gamification says you're still in the real world. You're still at your normal job. You're still on a website because you want to buy a product. Gamification says let's make that experience better. Learn from games, find elements from games that can enhance the experience that you're having. Find the meaningful core of those experiences and make them more rewarding, create greater motivation, but not pull you out of the real world. Similarly, there are many situations involving games and work that aren't gamification. So, you know what the most successful video game of all time is? It's Windows Solitaire, as you see there on the screen. 9 billion hours that people played this game in 2003. That was the latest data that we have, and that was a long time ago. Where do you think they play it? Much of the time, people play it at work. It's something people do when work is boring. Gamification is about finding things that are not boring in work and using game elements to enhance them. So it's very different than just saying there's games at work, that's gamification, or we're going to make work more game-like. It's also different from using games in a business context. So I mentioned earlier the Cracker Jack Toy Surprise as a game-like approach to selling a product. Well and good, not gamification. Similarly, the McDonald's Monopoly game is a very successful promotion for them for many years, and it involves playing a scratch-off game when you're at the McDonald's stores. Again, not about changing the experience of a McDonald's, not about learning things from games and taking pieces from games and putting them into the business process itself. It's about using a game to make people feel like they're more willing to come into the store because they're going to get some kind of reward. So it's a cousin to gamification, but it's about using actual games as opposed to breaking games down, thinking about what games can teach us in those contexts. Another example of using entire games, which I've already mentioned, is serious games. Serious games, as I said, can be extremely powerful for simulation, for systems thinking, for education. But again, they are games. They are purpose-built to create an immersive experience that puts a person into an environment. And that's different from thinking about what can be taken from games and put into the existing environment to change it, to make it feel more engaging, and to create better motivation. Now, gamification is also in some ways broader than many people think. The previous examples were contexts where gamification is more specific. Here, I'm going to talk about how gamification is bigger than people sometimes talk about. Gamification is sometimes thought of as purely about marketing, purely about getting people to buy things or getting people to be more engaged with companies. Similarly, it's often thought about as just points, badges, and leaderboards, or PBLs, as I like to talk about them, and I'll explain in a later session. So here is Samsung Nation, which is an offering on the Samsung website, and you can see it's got various badges and awards that you can win. It's got points that people get. It's got a leaderboard. It's got rewards. All standard gamification elements. This is clearly an example of gamification. The point I want to make is not every example of gamification looks like that. We already saw when I gave you 3 examples in the last segment, the Microsoft Language Quality game and the speed ticket lottery in Sweden didn't really look like this. So gamification is much broader than these kinds of examples, although they do fit within gamification. The danger is thinking that there's something magical about points and leaderboards and rewards, and that thing is what gamification is. It's actually only a subset. Finally, gamification should be distinguished from game theory. Now, game theory has a deep relationship to games and therefore to gamification, but it's something different. Game theory is a set of algorithms and formulas and quantitative techniques for analyzing strategic decision making. The Wikipedia entry that I put up here says game theory is the study of strategic decision making using mathematical models. So game theory uses stylized concepts of games, people competing or agents competing against each other, but they aren't typically real world games like Call of Duty or Angry Birds or checkers or football, which have that element of fun and enjoyment and engagement to them. So certainly there are things that can be learned from game theory that are relevant for gamification. For example, one of the most famous game theory examples is the prisoner's dilemma, a scenario where 2 prisoners would be better off, both of them, if they cooperated, but the way the rules are set up, the incentives are for them not to cooperate. Those kinds of models can be useful in thinking about gamified systems, but game theory is more about defining formal models and mathematical structures to analyze those kinds of behaviors, which is different from what we're going to be doing in this course. All right, so I've told you all the things that gamification is not. What is it then? I gave you the definition. Use of game elements and game design techniques in non-game contexts. Here are 3 other things that gamification does. The first is gamification is about listening to games. In other words, gamification means the recognition that games are powerful, that games can teach us things, that games are designed in sophisticated ways, that if we understand what those mechanisms are, and we understand how to apply those same techniques, we can achieve powerful business results. Secondly, gamification is about learning from game design, but also learning from fields like psychology and management and marketing and economics. It's a way in to understand things about motivation, about human behavior, whether that's in a workplace context, a marketing context, a crowdsourcing context, or a behavior change context, learning deep things about what makes people act in a certain way and design patterns to activate those aspects of human behavior, that's what gamification can do. And finally, gamification fundamentally is about fun. Fun, that difficult to define concept, which I will talk about in a later segment. Gamification recognizes that fun is powerful, that one of the things that makes games so important and so significant throughout all of human history is that they're more than just mathematical models. Yes, a mathematical model can be used to play the game effectively, but the game is somehow more than that, in large part because the game creates this sense that we call fun. Let me give you one additional framework for understanding gamification in context. This comes from some articles by a group of authors led by Sebastian Detterding, an influential gamification analyst based in Germany. And here's the URL to one of these articles right here. If you want to find out more, they use a 2x2 matrix to explain gamification and to position it vis-a-vis other related concepts. On one axis is the difference between whole games or whole artifacts and partial ones or parts. On the other axis, they distinguish play from games. And this is a distinction that I'll explain in more detail in a later segment, but for now, think about games as things involving rules and structure and winning and losing, whereas play is pure exuberant fun, pure release of exuberant energy in that kind of context. So what they do in this article is they distinguish along those axes 4 different quadrants. So the quadrant here involving play and whole artifacts, they say, well, that's toys. When you play with something and it's a thing, that's called a toy. And if you play but we're not making an entire thing, they say, well, that's called playful design. It's about designing using the notion of play, making things feel a little bit more playful, a little bit more fun, but not systematically structuring them with rules and goals and so forth. On the top left quadrant, if something is a game and it's a whole artifact, well, that's games. But specifically, for our purposes, that's where we would put serious games. Because again, serious games are full-blown games to address non-game uses, and that distinguishes them from gamification, which of course goes here in the top right quadrant. Gamification being using parts of games to address non-game challenges. It fits in this quadrant right here. And if you can't read my scribblings, here's the original chart from the article that they provide, which shows these 4 quadrants. And so this should give you a sense of how gamification fits in with some other concepts that are related but valuable to distinguish. What is a game? Seems like a fairly obvious question. We all know what games are. We all play games. So it's easy to define, right? A game is a game. Turns out that it's extraordinarily difficult when you think about it to figure out what it is that makes something a game. And we don't want to get too hung up on semantics here. It's not that in order to do gamification, you need to get some approval by the official game board that what you're doing truly involves games. But to understand how to tap into the power of games and to understand how to create things that are actually game-like would help to have as a starting point an understanding of what a game is. So it turns out that this is a deep philosophical question. And there have been a number of works by major philosophers that have taken on just this challenge, defining what a game is. And of course, this is not a philosophy course, but it's helpful to understand some of those perspectives because, as we'll see, they teach lessons that are going to be very valuable in understanding the power of games as used for gamification. The starting point here is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Hello, Ludwig. Famous 20th century philosopher. And in his masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein used games as one of his core examples about the difficulty, in fact, the impossibility of using language to define things. The point that he made, or the argument that he made, was that it is impossible to define what a game is. We think that we know what games are, and we have no trouble pointing to something in the real world and saying, aha, that's a game. Back here, I have Cranium, that's a game. Back here I have a bowling trophy. That's a trophy about someone playing a game. We understand what games are, right? Well, it gets harder to say what is the framework that defines games. How can you give a concise definition of games that is comprehensive? So maybe think about it a little for yourself. The question is, given all the different kinds of games, what is it that ties together hopscotch and Call of Duty and water polo and all of the different kinds of things that we talk about as games? There's not one aspect that you can find in common. Many of them have points or scoring, many of them have winning and losing, many of them have teams, but there's no one thing like that that applies to all games. So Wittgenstein's point here in Philosophical Investigations was you can't figure out, as he says, how the concept of a game is bounded. What counts as a game and what no longer does, he says, can you give the boundary? No. So Wittgenstein's argument is impossible task to define games. Well, fortunately, that's not the end point, or we wouldn't have much to say here. Other philosophers took up this challenge. One of the more interesting was a Canadian philosopher named Bernard Suits. And Suits took on Wittgenstein directly and said, actually, Ludwig, we can define what a game is. Wittgenstein, of course, was really not trying to make a point about games. He was trying to make a point about the indeterminacy of language and the nature of human thought. But Suits was focused specifically on games. And what Suits says is we can define every possible game based on three concepts. The first is that games have what he called a pre-lusory goal. Lusory here comes from the Latin word ludus, which means game. We'll see it again in different contexts. So the first thing Suits said was, in any game, there's some objective of the game. If you are playing ping pong, table tennis, the objective is to hit a ball over a net. You can talk about hitting a ball over a net without regard to the game of ping pong. If the game is the 400-meter race, the goal is to get from the starting point to the finish line of the race. If the game is checkers, the goal is to capture all of your opponent's pieces. We can talk about that without necessarily referring to all the rules of any of those games. So, first thing we need is a goal. We've already talked about this. Games have goals. The second thing you need is what Suits called constitutive rules, a set of rules or limitations that make the activity into a game. So if it's checkers, the rules include the fact that the pieces can only move one space diagonally and only forward until they become a king, and they can only capture by jumping over diagonally if there's an open square on the other side. If it's ping pong, the rules include the ball can't bounce twice on your side, you have to hit it over the net, and it has to land on your opponent's side of the table. Any game has those rules, and those rules are what make it game-like as opposed to just some work objective. The third element is what Suits called a lusory attitude. So there's that word again, lusory, a game-like attitude. What that means is the player follows the rules, and they do so voluntarily. They do so because they have an attitude which says the game means something. Sure, I could play ping pong with an air cannon and using a baseball and fire it 100 miles an hour across the table, not just at my opponent's side of the table, but directly at my opponent's head. And I could do that and say, haha, I've hit the ball over the net, I win the game. But that, whatever that was, wouldn't be ping pong. And the point is, if I care about ping pong, then I'm not going to do that. That's cheating. I can win the 400-meter race by racing directly across the infield, cutting across in a shortcut to the finish line, but that's cheating, and that is doing something other than effectively playing the game of a 400-meter race. So the point here is, if it's a game, it means something to the players. They want to follow the rules of the game, even though they limit the players' freedom. So another way that Suits put this was, a game is voluntarily overcoming unnecessary obstacles. There are obstacles in our path. We don't have to overcome them, and yet we do. Voluntarily. A game must be voluntary for it to be a game. So think about how this relates to gamification. First of all, think about how it relates to every game you can think of. Try and think about different games and how they might fit into Suit's three-part test. But then think about what it means if a game is something that's voluntary, something that has an objective, something that has limitations, and something that has the player thinking that the game is meaningful so that they follow the rules of the game. The final piece of the puzzle comes from the work of an early to mid-20th century Dutch philosopher named Johann Huizinga. And he wrote a book that became very influential called Homo Ludens. Ludens from that same Latin word ludus as the illusory attitude that Bernard Suits talks about. And the book is an extended argument that games and play are essential to what makes us human, even to the serious things in life like religion and government and the legal system. But the point that I want to emphasize here is a concept that Huizinga developed in the book called the magic circle. And his idea was that in a game, there is a physical or a virtual boundary that divides the world of the game from what we could call the real world. In other words, the game is different. It might be a traditional physical boundary, like, for example, the lines around a soccer field. If you are on the pitch, you are playing the game. If you are in the stands, you're not. But it might also be a conceptual boundary. When you sit down and start to play a video game, you are, in a virtual way, embedding yourself in the game. And the point is, when you're in the magic circle, the game rules matter, not the rules of the real world. So this ties into Suit's notion of voluntariness and a illusory attitude, but the notion is that we're essentially in a virtual environment, whether we're, again, on a playing field or looking at a computer screen. We're thinking that the game matters and we should follow the rules of the game more so than focusing on following the rules of the real world. Now, gamification, as I've said, involves elements of games and concepts and techniques from games rather than full-blown games. So the challenge and the opportunity for gamification is to put the player as much as possible in the magic circle. If you feel like the game matters, whether that's Club Psych or Kiss or the speed camera lottery or any of the examples I've given, if the player feels like that's important, those are real constraints, then they will be motivated to play and to respond to the incentives that the gamified system provides. It's important to distinguish the concept of games from that of play. And as we'll see, both of them are important for understanding how to be effective in doing gamification. The thinker who best articulated this division was a French intellectual named Roger Caillois, and he described the opposition of the two concepts which he called ludus on the one hand and paideia on the other hand. Ludus from that same Latin word that we talked about that basically means games. Paideia from the Greek for child, which we can represent as play. And Caillois looked at these as basically two different poles, two opposites at some level. So what does that mean? Think about it. If you think just colloquially, what's the difference between play and games? Obviously, they're connected. But is there some fundamental difference? What do we mean when we talk about play that's different from when we talk about games? Here's some quotes from philosophers and game designers, first on the concept of play. The first one comes from the philosopher Friedrich Schiller, who talks about play as the expenditure of exuberant energy. Santayana, another philosopher, says play is done spontaneously, for its own sake. Lev Vygotsky, who is an influential education theorist, talked about play as creating a zone of proximal development. This was an essential element in Vygotsky's educational theories. Basically, the notion is a child, when he or she is learning, has a certain level that they have attained, but they have a potential capacity that's substantially greater than that. The zone of proximal development is the level that the child can get to with the help of a great teacher and an educational system. They can reach beyond themselves and therefore advance and move up and learn. So Vygotsky, interestingly, here says play, which we normally think of as the stuff you do when you're not learning, when you're not in class. He says play actually helps the child reach that zone of proximal development, and in play, a child always behaves beyond his average age. The final quote is from Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman, two game designers who wrote an influential book called The Rules of Play, which I'd encourage you to look at if you're interested in getting deeper into these notions about what makes a game and how game designers think. And they say play is free movement within a more rigid structure. So what all of these things are talking about is that play is freedom. Play is doing whatever you want, but it's within some structure. There are some limits. Inside this world, you can be yourself and try out anything and just goof off. But you're in an environment that constrains your ability to do that. Sound familiar? Sounds a lot like the magic circle that we talked about before in the work of Huizinga. Okay, that's play. Think about the relevance of play to gamification. This idea of exuberant energy, this idea of doing something for its own sake, really powerful, gets to the heart of fun and engagement and some of the things that in a gamified system we want to create for the players. The second term is games. So how are games different from play? Here's some quotes. The first is from Tracy Fullerton and her two co-authors, the authors of a major textbook on game design. And they say a game is a closed formal system that engages players in a structured conflict and resolves in an unequal outcome. So here we see something very different than when we were talking about play. Play was exuberant and for its own sake and so forth. Games are formal, they are structured, and they produce outcomes. Similarly, Sid Meier, a famous game developer, he wrote most notably the Civilization series of games, says that a game is a series of meaningful choices. I love this quote. It encapsulates a lot of what's in the previous quote, but boils it down to the essence. There's a formal system, but that system, essentially what it does is creates a set of choices, and the choices have meaning. Something happens based on what you do. The actions that you take produce different results. And the game, therefore, is about taking the right actions to produce the result that you're going for. Thomas Malaby is an anthropologist, actually, at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee who studies games in virtual worlds. And he talks about games as a domain of contrived contingency that generates interpretable outcomes. So here, the interpretable outcomes, this is very similar to the concept that we saw up here about outcomes. The key point, though, that Malaby adds is this notion of contingency, randomness, chance. And it's contrived. The game manually puts that contingency in to create an environment where your choices are meaningful. Finally here, Jesse Schell, the game designer we met before from his DICE talk about gamification, he talks about a game as a problem-solving activity approached with a playful attitude. And hopefully this notion of a playful attitude should look familiar, relating back to what I described in the prior video about Soot's notion of losery attitude. And it connects up the concept of games, the problem-solving activity, the structure within a set of rules to get an outcome, with the notion of play. So therefore, a game looks something like this. It's a branching path where we have a set of choices, and each choice leads to various outcomes, and each choice we make might give us other choices, and other choices, and other choices. Some of them connect back up, some of them don't, and whatever we do, it produces some result. And in getting from one point to another, we start here, and we finish here. And this is the goal of the game. Moving through that pathway, taking the path that we choose to take through this environment, is play at some level. We have freedom in what we do. We could make a wrong turn and go down here and not get to the result, but let's assume we don't. We eventually get to the finish line. We have that choice in what we do. The game design, the structure that is put into place, is what gives us an opportunity to make those choices, feel that sense of freedom, actually have that freedom, but be in an environment that allows our choices to have meaning and to feel meaningful getting to a result. So here's an exercise you might do based on what I've just described. Make a list of things in your life that involve play, and then make another list of things that involve games. And to make it more challenging, don't list activities that are primarily recreational or entertainment oriented. Try to think about things from work, or from school, or from your social life, or from your interaction with, say, the government or with businesses. Think about things that are more play-like and things that are more game-like and what distinguishes them. Here's a few quick takeaways before we wrap up this segment for how the philosophical discussion that I've given you relates back to gamification. The first is to emphasize the concept of voluntariness. This was in Suit's definition of games as voluntarily overcoming unnecessary obstacles, and it runs all the way through, especially for play, because play is free-form, exuberant action for no purpose, but even for games, the user has to feel the choices are meaningful, and therefore they have to be voluntary choices. James P. Carse, who wrote a delightful little book called Finite and Infinite Games, he's a professor at NYU, says, and I'm paraphrasing, whoever must play cannot play. If you're forced to do something, it's not a game. This is a concept we'll come back to later when we talk about gamification in enterprises and in the workplace. Second point here is that games involve learning or problem solving. If they don't, they're play. Play, again, can just be spontaneous energy. Games have some structure, some objectives, and at some level there has to be a challenge, which is a problem to be solved. And finally, designing a game is a balance. We're going to come back to this when we talk about game design, and it's a balance, at least in part, between the structure, the rules of the game, and that open-ended, free-form, play-like sense of exploration. Too much of one, and the game's not any fun because the possibilities are too limited. Too much of the other, and the game has no purpose, and it's just wandering around without getting anywhere, which doesn't make the player have as much fun typically, and really doesn't achieve the objectives of the game designer, or in this case, the organization that implemented the gamified system. Up till now, I've been talking about games in a very general, abstract sense because gamification draws upon basic principles that are common to all games. But it also draws specifically upon a certain category of games, namely video games. And most of the gamification examples that we're going to think about involve online digital systems which are directly related to what we see in video games. So it's worth understanding the video game industry also because the size of it and the scale of it and the pervasiveness of it are part of why the motifs of gamification are so familiar. So we start 40 years ago, 1972 or so, with Pong, the first mass-market successful video game. Still gives me chills. Here it is. Pong was a revolution. There it is. Because it allowed people to interact with what was on their screen. It, by today's standards, of course, was unbelievably primitive. And it's hard to imagine how anyone would get interested in what you see behind me on the screen there. But Pong, for the first time, gave people the power to interact with a digital game at home. And since then, the video game industry has grown, and now, as I said, it's 40 years old. It is both substantial as a business phenomenon, pervasive in the experience of especially the younger generation of people, particularly in the West, but in many other parts of the world as well. And video games have developed a very sophisticated language of how to express themselves and entertain and engage people. Here's one example just to show what I'm talking about here. This is Cityville, one of the casual social games on Facebook made by Zynga. And Cityville, as you can see, is clearly a game and a fairly graphically simple game, at least compared to some of the rich 3D immersive games that we have on consoles and PCs today. Here's the interesting thing about Cityville. Cityville was launched by Zynga in 2011. In 41 days, it hit 100 million registered users. 6 weeks. 0 to 100 million registered users. An extraordinary rate of growth, and it's not limited to just this one game or this one company. This is a huge phenomenon. So here are some statistics to capture just how big the video game industry is today. The industry, depending on whose numbers you take, is somewhere on the order of $60 to $80 billion a year in revenues. Double the revenues of Hollywood from box office sales of films. Films make money from other mechanisms as well, including tie-ins with games. But if you talk about box office revenues, games are already much bigger and they're growing faster than Hollywood. The second is that games are evolving to the point where online games played or distributed online as opposed to on consoles like the PlayStation and Xbox and Nintendo Wii, or downloaded in a box and loaded on a PC. The online games are growing faster and are poised to become the biggest segment of the games marketplace. And interestingly, already the biggest component of the online games marketplace is China. So it's not just an American or a Western phenomenon. The third is that games are becoming the foundation for other industries. Virtual goods I will talk about later in the class, but these are things that you can buy within the game. Think about a brand new sword for a player in a massively multiplayer online game, or some additional seeds and other equipment that you might use in a Zynga game like Farmville, things that you pay real money for that appear in the game. This economy around virtual goods is already many billions of dollars, 7.3 billion globally and 2 billion in the US, according to the latest statistics I could find. A very substantial market, which is not games themselves, but something built on top of the great success of games. And finally, the other great evolution is the rise of mobile games. This was a study early in 2012 that found that 44% of people, US and UK, had played a mobile game, something like an Angry Birds, on their smartphone in the last month. So the games industry is big and it's developing, and I think it's fair to talk about it as the mass medium of the 21st century. Here are just a few statistics about usage numbers. If you look at things like the Zynga games, lots of people, I talked about 100 million on Cityville, 250 million, 250 million unique registered users, and that it was already probably a few months old. They've surpassed that. Angry Birds alone, over 100 million. Xbox Live games, 35. World of Warcraft, over 10 million players. World of Warcraft, those are paying players, so that's even more important in terms of monetization. The other important piece, though, is how much time people are using these things. And so those 10 million World of Warcraft players up here, if you look at the amount of time they spend, it's actually huge. It's 50 billion minutes a month, because they're playing for long periods of time. Whereas something like Angry Birds, even though it has a higher user base, is only a mere 12 billion minutes a month that people are playing, because people use it less. Still a pretty big number. And if you look at something like the Xbox Live games, which are the core console games, so therefore things people play more, 120 billion minutes a month. So figure out how much that is across the player base and figure out how much time that actually represents relative to traditional media. It's not the same thing as people having their television on for 7 hours a day in the home, but this is interactive time. It's time where the player is directly engaged in playing the game. Big, big numbers. So the important thing here to take away is that games are a mass phenomenon. And just to correct a misunderstanding that people sometimes have, they are not just a mass phenomenon for teenage boys. It's true that the highest percentage of gamers is teenagers and young adults, 12 to 17-year-olds in the US. The study by the Pew Research Foundation found 97% play some kind of video games, virtually everyone. But it's not just them. The Entertainment Software Association has found that the average gamer is actually 30 years old. And if you know anything about averages, that means there's a whole lot of them that are older than 30. Moreover, it's not just boys or men. Almost half of all video game players today are women. There are some skewing effects. Women, generally speaking, tend to play more of the social, casual games. Men tend to play more of the first-person shooter types of games. But overall, if you talk about video games as an experience, as a mass medium, as a phenomenon that people are conversant with and familiar with, it cuts across all of those boundaries. And the final point is that video games are not just going in and guns blazing, blowing something up and shooting things. Sure, there are games that involve that, and some of them have been very successful. But especially in recent years, we've seen the rise of many different categories of games that are very different. So, for example, the sandbox games, things like Minecraft, which if you're not familiar with, you should go check out. Minecraft is a game that was written by a single developer that is incredibly rudimentary in terms of its graphics, has no purpose. You go into Minecraft, you're given a world, and you have to dig things up and find different kinds of ore and chop down trees and do other things to create raw materials and then put them together in different ways and build things. Why? Well, because it's fun. And it turns out that Minecraft has been a sensation. Huge numbers of users voluntarily paying money to play this game, which in most of the time that they were doing so was far from finished. It was expressly in alpha or beta form. People found this incredibly compelling, in part because they could share their creations with other people. It gave them a huge sandbox. You could make anything you want in Minecraft. Another category are the building games. So here I mentioned already Civilization by Sid Meier, the SimCity games by Will Wright, games that let you create and build things. Again, not to kill, but to figure out how your actions in running a complex system like a city or like a nation state create results as they interact with each other and with other parts of the system. A derivative of those are what I'll call social building games. Here's where we see things like Farmville and The Sims. Games that have that construction, building element, but also involve collaborating with and interacting with other players in the game, showing off what you're doing for other players, having a social dimension in addition to that building dimension. Very popular, very successful. Then we have the massively multiplayer online games, things like World of Warcraft, which again have been quite successful and do have some measure of running around and killing things, but also have guilds and communities and things like auction houses and things like leveling up characters in different skill areas and crafting and exploring worlds. A rich experience, much more than just the pure competitive, pure destruction element of games. And finally, puzzle games, things like Angry Birds, where you have to figure out, how do I pull this slingshot just the right way to knock over the structure? Or Portal and Portal 2, very successful hit game in recent years, in which the player has to figure out how to create holes in a wall that, when you put them together, solve a puzzle of how to get out of a room. If you haven't played, go and look at some YouTube videos or some information on the game. Really successful, powerful game using simple kinds of problem-solving mechanics. And the point here is that these are not outliers or exceptions. These, in many cases, are the most successful game releases in recent years. So games are big, they are sophisticated, they are pervasive across modern life, and they are diverse. They are not just as simple as you might think, and they're not just about graphics. They're about all these different forms of interaction, individually and socially. Hopefully by now I've impressed upon you the significance of games in general and video games in particular, but it's still worth talking about the concept that many people have in their head when they hear about something like gamification, which is the assumption that games are somehow trivial, insignificant, not serious, not worthy of thought when we're talking about business or we're talking about major, important, serious kinds of objectives. So let me confront that in several ways before we leave the topic of games. The first is to point out the connection between video games and gamification as well to many of the core trends in both the technology world as well as business in general. So when we talk about e-business and e-commerce, many of the important developments are things like analytics, getting dashboards, using big data to pull together very, very rich, detailed data sets about individual users and their activities online. That's also a core element of games. If you think about social game companies like Zynga, they are constantly doing A/B testing to try out different things, constantly collecting data on every interaction that their users have with the game and shaping the experience based on that data. And in many ways, that is the future of video games, and also a very important element of effective gamification, because gamification relies as well on that data. People interacting with the systems generate very rich data sets which can be mined to understand how to make the gamified system more effective. Cloud. So a big trend right now is the growth of massive data centers that do processing and storage centrally as opposed to on local computers, and therefore can take advantage of efficiencies and massive scale processing power. Cloud is also a huge development in the games world. As we move from games downloaded and put in a box and put on a CD or DVD in someone's computer to games delivered across the network, increasingly games become cloud-like. And gamification, like any web-based system, can be delivered using this same infrastructure. And finally, mobile. I already talked about mobile games like Angry Birds, huge growth rate, huge rate of development in sophistication with the growth of smartphones and tablets. The games industry is going towards mobile just like everything else. The second one here is social. As I've talked about, games are powerfully social, and video games are also powerfully social, and all of the techniques of using social networks, leveraging the social graph, and getting insights about people and making experiences richer and more valuable using those social tools, all of that is also deeply embedded in the video games industry today and the direction that the video games industry is going, and similarly something to be taken advantage of in gamification. So those are two digital building blocks for gamification. Two non-digital building blocks. The first is loyalty programs, things like frequent flyer miles or credit card reward programs. Massive industry. 2 billion reward program memberships in the US alone, roughly $50 billion of rewards outstanding. Huge numbers. Now, part of the reason that those loyalty programs are valuable is all those rewards don't get redeemed. But clearly there is something going on here when virtually every travel company and virtually every financial services credit card type company uses some sort of rewards program in their business. As we'll talk about, these loyalty programs don't go far enough in some of the ways that gamification can. They don't leverage fun and progression and these game dynamics nearly to the full extent. And they also have all sorts of problems in terms of being manipulative and not necessarily serving the user's interest. But they provide some foundation for understanding how game mechanics, things like points and levels and representations of achievement like badges, have value and can be used in a business context. And similarly, if you look at many of the important theories in management in areas like organizational behavior and work design, as well as key theories in marketing about customer segmentation and customer analytics, all of them fit very neatly into the games industry today, but in particular into gamification. So we're not talking about things here that are divorced from what you might learn about in a digital marketing course or in a digital strategy course. We're talking about things that are very much in line of all of those kinds of developments. Second piece here is that games, video games I mean, and the real world are coming closer together. On the one hand, games are becoming increasingly real by moving the real world into the game. So I talked about serious games, simulations. This that you see on the screen here is one called America's Army. It's a first-person shooter, realistic 3D game for being a soldier in the U.S. Army, and it is produced by the U.S. Army. Why? Recruiting. Getting people aware of what being in the Army entails, encouraging people to get familiar with and get excited about the process of being in the Army, and to some extent weeding out people who are not right for the Army because they have a misunderstanding about the skills and the character traits that it requires. Most successful recruiting tool in the Army's history, they say. And it's a video game. So this and many other things are about taking the real world and putting it into games. The reverse is also happening. Games are coming to the real world. I've already alluded to a variety of examples. One of them has to do with these virtual goods. So you'll recall I talked about the multi-billion-dollar industry around virtual goods. But there's also a gray market industry that's called gold farming. People playing games like World of Warcraft, where the player has to generate gold and use the gold to buy things, and the gold can be traded with other players on an auction house or something like that. It turns out that if you run a company in, say, China, where wages are much lower than the US, you can employ a bunch of people to play World of Warcraft 8, 10, 12 hours a day, acquire gold, and then take the gold that they've collected and the valuable assets in the game, turn them around and sell them through a group of middlemen to people in the West. And they will pay real money for that gold. And the real money they will pay will be more than at the other end of the chain, what you have to pay the people playing the game to accumulate the gold. Estimates are that there are at least 100,000, perhaps as many as 400,000 people in China who make their living playing games like World of Warcraft as gold farmers. Again, typically working for these intermediary companies. It's a multi-billion-dollar gray market industry. That's an example of something that comes out of games. The gold isn't real. It's totally virtual, and yet it has real value to people. Up here, I put a screenshot of the cover of a book called Play Money by my friend Julian DeBell. If you're interested in gold farming and virtual goods, Julian has been covering this for years, and the book is about his own experiences trading virtual assets for real money. The final piece here is that when we ask, are games real or do they matter in the real world, it's actually a false question. Because if you go out and look at many phenomena in the real world through the lens of gamification, turns out they're already game-like. So what is the monthly sales competition between a sales force? First prize is a car, second prize is steak knives, third prize is a pink slip, or something like that. What is that but a challenge? A competitive challenge. If you get the most sales in this month, you get a prize. What is a frequent flyer program? A loyalty program, which I've already talked about, but a set of points that then levels you up to go from an ordinary plebeian individual on a plane to a premier flyer, to a premier executive flyer, to a global services customer, the top tier on United Airlines, is about leveling up in a game, only the game is called the Frequent Flyer Program. Weight Watchers groups. One of the reasons that Weight Watchers is successful in getting people to lose weight is that it puts people together in a team. You're sharing information with other people as opposed to just doing it on your own. The free coffee after 10 purchases at any local retailer, well, that's a reward. You get various things. There's also things like completion mechanics there. But ultimately, it's about rewarding people for their practices. And another example, the American Express card. Here we have the levels, but here I want to point out things like the Platinum card is a representation. It says, hey, I am important. I've reached this point by virtue of my spending in the program, and that Platinum card itself in gamification we'd call a badge. So none of these are foreign concepts when you think about them. Gamification is just about using them and applying them in a systematic way, given all of the power that we have with these digital technologies. I'm here with my colleague Ethan Mollick from the management department at Wharton, who's done some really interesting work looking at games in business. first, Ethan, just tell us a little bit about how you got interested in this set of topics.
So, first of all, like I think a lot of people interested in games, I started off, or gamification, I started off by being interested in games, so I played games for a long time. And that brought me into sort of the early days of what was then called serious games, or gamification. I did work helping do game design for the military to teach cultural understanding. I got pulled into doing games for education to teach things like financial literacy with the Doorways to Dreams Foundation. And that led me to doing more serious work on this, including writing a book on games and business and studying gamification much more seriously.
So your book, Changing the Game, came out in 2009, right? So it's several years ago now. How do you think that the market has changed? How do you think understanding of these kinds of questions has changed?
So, first of all, we were just too early for the invention of the word gamification, which I eternally regret. We called it like serious games or games for innovation or games to encourage work. So I think there's been a massive takeoff of this idea. I think that in some ways we're a little bit stuck where we've been over and over again in the world of gamification, which is, no matter what name it's been called, there's always been this difficulty breaking out just enough into the mainstream, just figuring out how to get people to use this, sharing information with each other about the best approaches, and coming up with answers that are supported by evidence that games actually work and do what they're supposed to do. So while I'm really encouraged by the number of ways people are using gamification right now, I still think we have a ways to go in establishing best practices. And part of what I'm excited about with this class is that you have a leader role in doing that.
Well, we're trying, but so let me just ask you to follow up a little on some of the things that you said. I mean, I tend to think of serious games and gamification as being different. That one is about these kind of full-blown game-like environments, and one is about the elements. Do you agree with that, or do you have kind of a different take on it?
Yeah, I think that part of this is the eternally shifting definitions here. So gamification can mean something as narrow as taking ideas from games and applying them to real life, or it can mean using games for some sort of non-entertaining purpose. So I'm happy with that division, if you want to call it that. And the warning I would sort of put out to your students is that the vocabulary means different things to different people. So if you want to consider serious games to be full-blown simulations, that's fine by me. But I think that the definitions aren't commonly shared across every group.
Mm-hmm. So when you're talking to people, businesses, military, government, and stuff, what do you find most effective to get them to understand the potential of these game-like techniques?
So I think once they understand the scale of gaming, that often helps, right? So the number of hours spent playing Angry Birds last year was somewhere north of 8 or 11 billion hours, which is about the equivalent to building the Panama Canal every day, right? Once you start getting that workload, the idea that non-gamers have to understand how big this is, that can help. I also think understanding that there's a linkage between gamification and what we know about psychology and sociology, these are not new topics, right? The idea of designing incentives to get people to act properly is not new. So if you can link it to these ideas of behavioral economics, of social psychology, I think that's also a very helpful technique.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you mentioned the need for more best practices and so forth. What do you think is mostly missing right now in gamification that could be improved?
So I think a few things. I think, first of all, mistakes tend to get buried. We're in a situation where most people creating games are only sharing their success stories. They tend to share it as cases with vague details. And it's very hard to build on only successes when we don't know about the failures that are happening. And it's hard to build on vague details if someone's not sharing information. So I hope we move past this sort of rah-rah gamification's great and a defensive community where we're trying to show everybody that this is a great thing, to actually sharing both successes and failures, because I think that's how things advance. I think having common toolkits we work with, sets of techniques that we know are good or bad, those things will all be helpful, and more basic research also.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're a management scholar. What do you think that you or people like you can bring to the table in this area?
So, as I think I told you, the study of games isn't even that new. So there has been evidence and scholars writing about the importance of games at work since the 1920s. There's evidence that during the building of the pyramids, games were used as one of the motivating factors for competing teams of workers. I mean, these are not new phenomenon. And as a result, people have been thinking about these things for a long time. And they've been thinking of them in the context of what motivates people to act. All these other factors that affect when games work and when they don't. So competition, compensation, gender, social status, all of these things come into play. So I think recognizing there's a long tradition of looking at how people are motivated in the management world, understanding how these many factors play against each other, and how they can be used for good or for bad purposes can be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think is new, potentially?
I think what's new about gamification is that it separates out the work somebody does from the work they think they're doing. So oftentimes compensation is about, your job is terrible, let's pay you more to do it better. Or let's figure out a way to make it less terrible. Or let's give you more control over the aspects of your job. And I think those are all still areas we're working on and figuring out how to do better. What makes gamification interesting is you could be playing a game where you're labeling images online, but you think that you're actually playing some sort of competitive game with other people where you're playing a word guessing game. You could be diagnosing code within the Department of Defense's computers, and you think you're identifying alien species on Mars. So the idea that you can actually make the work appear to be more interesting even without changing the underlying factors, I think is exciting. I think the other thing that gamification does is leverage the art of games. Right, so we have some cold hard facts about what motivates people and what doesn't, but games are much more art than science. So the idea that you're bringing together elements like graphics, like leaderboards, avatars, things that are beyond what our basic descriptions of gamification are in the literature, I think is really helpful too.
What would you say are some of the open research questions that we still need to learn more about?
So I think there's a understanding, or at least a belief in the gamification world, that games are generally good. People like them, and that's because a lot of people who do gamification like games, right? The fact is, most people don't like games, or every kind of game, and even people who love games don't like every kind of game, right? So the idea of trying to understand when this is motivating, when this is demotivating, when it's who you're turning off and who you're turning on by gameplay matters a lot. I think also understanding which of these features matter and which kinds of ways matter. And I think also, in a more largely social point, trying to understand when this is moral to do and when it isn't, right? So there's something coercive about having people play games instead of giving them other forms of compensation that might be more direct, right? Giving them virtual rewards instead of real rewards. At its best, that's really great and uplifting. At its worst, it's exploitative. And you think about the idea of of distancing people from the implications of their job, I find that a bit troubling, and there's some interesting work going on that as well.
Absolutely. So, any final words for our students out there in the course?
So I think we're in a very exciting time right now, and you're coming into gamification at just the right moment. So the initial sort of everybody's excited about this is still happening, but it's maybe dying down slightly, and we're now in a stage where we have to figure out how this works, and there's almost limitless potential to get this right, and there's a really interesting chance to explore. And I'd urge you, as you move forward in gamification, to make sure you're sharing, communicating, and viewing this as a community that's trying to get results together, rather than an individual who's trying to succeed.
Great, Ethan. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.